evening webinar series that EGROW is organizing. In this series, we try to bring the best minds across the world to speak to us on contemporary policy issues. As you know, that this think tank, EGROW Foundation, the basic objective is to provide advice based on rich research, and we believe in providing policy-oriented research. So here we are today. We are continuing with the inflation targeting series. We have had Professor Ravindra Dholakia speak to us 2 Fridays back. We have today with us Professor Kulabde Balakrishnan. Tomorrow we will have Professor Ashima Goel. Next Friday we have Chetan, and then we have Dr. Chetan Ghate, and then Dr. Paul. With this, for today's session, I hand over the mic to our chairman of EGROW Foundation, Dr. Arvind Virmani, as well as the chair of the session today. Dr. Virmani, please.
Dr. Virmani, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, thank you, Charan. So, let me start right away. We have 1 hour where we expect Professor to speak for 40 minutes and then have 20 minutes for Q&A. So, let me quickly introduce him. He's currently Professor of Economics at Ashoka University and also Senior Fellow at the Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode. He has been a professor at IIM Kozhikode from 1997 to 2007, Senior Fellow in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and also Professor of Development Studies from 2010 to 2015. He did his MA from JNU, an MPhil from the University of Oxford, and PhD from University of Cambridge. So really, he's done the tour of all the nice places, and he has written on and worked on pricing and inflation issues and economic growth in India. He is a recipient of the Malcolm Adishya Award for Distinguished Contribution to Development Studies, 2014. With that, let me hand it over to you, Professor Balakrishnan.
Thank you very much, everybody at EGROW to start with, in particular the chairman, Dr. Virmani, and Dr. Charan Singh for this invitation, which I'm very pleased to accept. Dr. Virmani, you may remember the only time we've met was on Carmichael Road in 1991. So that's about 30 years ago. And it's appropriate that we are discussing inflation targeting. So I will start now and go straight to my presentation. It's long-ish, but I will certainly finish in 40 minutes, maybe even in 30. So here goes. You need to give me a minute to go straight to my presentation. Also, we should thank Mr. Vivek of EGROW for having set all this up. Thank you. All right, so here we go to the screen directly. Yeah, okay, good. Now, the only thing that I want to ask you is how to look at that's not WebEx, that is my job. Here we are. All right, so I just also want to say that this is joint work with my colleague, Dr. M. Parameshwaran of the Center for Development Studies at Thiruvananthapuram. So, thank you. Right, so if I may, let me also read out the abstract just to bring everybody up to speed, so to speak. I mean, you may have read it, but it's always useful to have it read out again. So a line of argument found in some recent evaluations of inflation targeting is that it has succeeded in anchoring the expectations of inflation or inflation expectations. Presumably, this claim is based on the feature that the inflation rate has still recently mostly remain within the prescribed band since inflation targeting was formally adopted in 2016. The prescribed band, of course, as you know, 2 to 6%. We evaluate this claim by reference to the recent history of inflation in India and counter inflation. The results of the latter, i.e. the econometric tests, are conclusive, offer a data-congruent diagnosis of the inflationary process in India, and account for the trajectory of inflation in India since 2016. Finally, we assess the impact that inflation targeting has had on the economy. All right, background. Before inflation targeting, in general. Before inflation targeting, in general, sorry, there is an echo. I can't help it. Inflation targeting is one of a set of imagined inflation control policies. Now, skepticism about inflation targeting does not imply a rejection of inflation control as a legitimate objective of economic policy. Well before inflation targeting was advanced, Milton Friedman had brought inflation control center stage through his relentless expounding of the dangers of inflation and therefore the need to control it. As a monetarist, Friedman had prescribed money supply targeting as the means to control inflation. Inflation targeting prescribes the use of the interest rate to target inflation. Of course, the interest rate, which is in the control of the central bank, which is referred to as the repo rate in India. So what is new about inflation targeting is only the instrument chosen and not the goal itself. There is, however, the vague suggestion that inflation targeting is likely to be more effective than the monetarist approach, as the instrument, the policy rate that is directly under the control of the central bank. In India, the Reserve Bank of India. However, what has mostly remained hidden in the public discourse is the economic model that underlies inflation targeting. And this, I believe, is quite important in an evaluation of inflation targeting. This model, as we will see, asserts a transmission mechanism linking the change in the interest rate to inflation. Now, the theoretical backing for inflation targeting, now adopted by most of the leading central banks in the world, including the Reserve Bank of India, has come in the form of the new Keynesian Phillips curve. In this relation, i.e. the new Keynesian Phillips curve, as will be seen, inflation reflects a level of output higher than the potential or natural level, a gap that may be eliminated by appropriate movement of the interest rate controlled by the central bank. For this reason, it would not be appropriate to term it the income gap model of inflation as we do, i.e. the model underlying inflation targeting. We refer to as the output gap model of inflation. Führer et al. Referring to the following, refer to the following equation, that is, as a now canonical version of the new Keynesian Phillips curve, where the dependent variable is or the variable on the left-hand side is the inflation rate. The right-hand side has the output gap YT, a constant, and expectation at time t of inflation at time pt minus 1. I guess it's quite easy to interpret this. And beta, CO, and gamma are all constant. So inflation, once again, a function quite simply of the output gap and the expectation of inflation in the next period. Note the centrality of the natural level of output to this explanation of inflation. Once again, the natural rate of output or the output gap is the difference between actual output and the natural rate of output. So the natural level of output, sorry, not natural rate of output, excuse myself. I'm mistaken for the natural rate of unemployment. Natural level of output is central to the output gap model or this explanation of inflation. Now, the natural level of output is unobservable. It can be measured only subject to assumptions and in theory subject to change. Methods, however, have been proposed for measurement of the output gap, and we have followed the most prominent ones. So before I go on to look at some of the econometric work, I would just like to look at some of the data, data on recent inflation in India, which I believe actually is extremely important, even though it is not necessarily analyzed in a statistical way, but I think this evidence of recent inflation in India is extremely informative about the role played by inflation targeting in recent inflation in India. And I shall flag three features in this scrutiny of recent inflation in India. One, inflation has remained within the band since 2016, except during the pandemic. As my co-author M. Parameshwaran, who is in on this meeting, because Charan very kindly gave us the link, pointed out to me, actually, it's not. It has begun to increase even before the pandemic. But anyway, it has certainly remained within the band for quite a long part of the period, about 4 years from 2016. However, it has also stayed within the band, even in the distant past, is something which we would like to point out to you. And three, this is the third feature of what we refer to as the recent history of inflation, which is inflation since about 2000, for 20 years, that is. And finally, it entered the prescribed band some 6 quarters before 2016, having been on a downward trend for close to 16 quarters. So I just want to go back here and each of the 3 points. It's inflation since 2016. Yeah, inflation has largely remained within the band. That's unquestionable. Whether it may have increased, started rising before the pandemic, but it has largely remained within the band. But the second point we want to say, but it's also remained within the band for a substantial period of time, maybe longer than after 2016, in the recent past, in the first half of this century, or the first decade of the century. It was well within the band for a large number of quarters, as you can see. This is the band, 2 to 6%. And finally, before it entered the band, which is already before 2016, it had been trending downwards. I say my eyesight is not so good as I can pick out the numbers by just looking at this. I have written here, it has been trending downward for close to 16 quarters, which is 4 years. So now let's actually look at some numbers instead of the graph. Here we are. It is correct from 17 onwards. It's been within the band. We don't look at 2021 mainly because it is an exceptional year in some ways. But it has been within the band. But it is correct that it already reached the band 2 years before that. This is a general index of the CPI. Oh, sorry, I had the data sources from the RBI, by the way. The general index of the CPI, yeah, which we have from 2011 onwards. You see the dramatic decline by the year before inflation targeting was formally adopted. It had already reduced by a substantial amount. Yeah, it had halved, by the way. And also, I was to say that just eyeballing the data, you find that actually the food and beverages food index, let me just call it, had declined, and probably declined at a faster rate. Yeah. So this does give us some what can I say, some reason to believe that food prices may have had something to do with the decline in the inflation rate from 12-13 onwards. Yeah, and finally, interestingly enough, CPI inflation, other than food and fuel, which you might want to call core, has also been declining over this period. Again, quite substantial, not quite halved, but very, very close to having been halved, which is quite significant and has a story to tell in itself, which I will come to at a later point. So yeah, so once again, this table basically just reiterates, as it were, what has been said in the graph. Yes, within the band, the inflation rate has been within the band after 2016, but had reached the band before and had been declining for about 16 quarters, 4 years before that. Now, the steady decline in food price inflation since 1213 is striking, and it gives us reason to believe that this has had a role in the decline in inflation in India, and possibly inflation remaining within the band after 2016. The behavior of core inflation, also declining in this period, though not as sharply, suggests that it could possibly have been driven by the behavior of food prices. I just want to bring this out right away. If this is so, i.e. that core inflation has been driven by food prices, the case for targeting core instead of headline inflation, a proposition always on the agenda of inflation, international policy entrepreneurs, and repeated by India's government economists, weakens, right? Because the core is not autonomous. If it's affected by food price inflation, then it does not have an autonomous status, and it's not very clear what targeting the core really means, whether it's going to be feasible or whether it's going to be meaningful. And I should return to this issue at a later point. All right. Now, so generally inflation was trending downward before 2016, when inflation targeting was formally adopted in India. Now, I just want to say something next about what the data on expectations shows. Data on expectations show, and this is data from the Reserve Bank of India, and it's quite helpful for us to look at it. Why am I insisting that we look at it? I'm insisting that we look at it because there is a claim made that inflation has remained within the band, mainly, of course, due to inflation targeting, and inflation targeting has achieved it by anchoring inflation expectations. So let's just go and look at the inflation expectations data. This is from the Reserve Bank of India, which does these surveys. So I want to, I'll say expectations and inflation is my next section. And I looked at what I refer to as two stylized facts. Let me go to the stylized facts and come back to the graph after that. So expectation of inflation, as more interestingly enough, has been fairly steady, so much so that you might want to say that they have been anchored, but they have remained at much higher than the upper end of the band for over 10 years now, i.e. from about 2010, that is. Interestingly, it was at its lowest in recent history, that is, from around 2008. And actual inflation, interestingly enough, has fluctuated more than expected inflation, as you will see in the graph in a minute. And I would like to say that this evidence is a challenge to the claim that expected inflation is a central determinant of actual inflation, with or without inflation targeting. I wouldn't push that argument very strongly. It's actually quite a mild statement. It just says this evidence is a challenge to the claim. That's all. Now let's look at the data. It's from the Reserve Bank of India. It's inflation expectations of households versus actual inflation. If I'm not mistaken, this is from the Report on Currency and Finance, which is almost entirely devoted to inflation targeting, the most recent one, as you know. So current inflation perception is the expectation, and the black line is combined, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index combined. And as I said, inflation expectations have been higher than actual, higher than within the band, quite a bit higher than the band. Now, this corresponds to about 11% or something. For almost the entire in the band, it declines from 11%, of course, for almost one decade from March 20. This is the most recent data we have. I just want to say in a minute, you might all wonder why we choose to look at perception of households rather than a group or a cohort that the RBI studies called professional forecasters. We study households because we think that is what the most relevant proposition is. I'm just saying, most relevant cohort is, because the whole Friedman interpretation of the Phillips curve, which underlies the output gap model, is all about misperceptions of workers or households, not for what are they called, formal or not of professional inflation forecasters. In some cases, it's not at all clear what the role of professional inflation forecasters is in this whole business at all. All right, so but unfortunately, we don't have data on, or the RBI doesn't provide us data on expectations of firms, though there is a very recent study by the IIM Ahmedabad, but I'm not sure. We don't use it, right? So these are two stylized facts. Yes, expectation has been, inflation has been steady, but it's been steady for about 10 years, well before inflation targeting. And certainly for 10 years, it has been above the, well above the upper end, well above the band, the upper end of the band of the prescribed band, the upper end being 6%. So this is the most recent period. This is again inflation expectations of households. Again, the dotted line expectations, and the what's it called, the flat line or the filled line, the actual, and we just want to what we wanted to flag here is expectations have been continued to remain right up to quite recently well above the upper band. But as my co-author pointed out to me after he saw the slides, I was wrong to say that the inflation actually flares up goes above the band only from the time of the pandemic. It starts from May 18, from May of 19. Sorry, apologize. But anyway, that's not the point we want to stress so much. We just want to say this suggests that the argument that inflation expectations have been anchored is a bit problematic if you look at the expectations data for households that comes out of the Reserve Bank of India. So and finally, the inflation during the lockdown. I just want to stop for a while and say, since we as social scientists and economists in particular cannot do control experiments, natural experiments is what we rely on, and in some sense the lockdown was a natural experiment, not a very happy one. It came in the form of a pandemic, but yes, it's close to being a natural experiment, or at least it's a COVID which drove the lockdown, and it'd be very useful to see what the data looks like in such periods, in particular the inflation data, since that is what we're studying. The flaring up of inflation from March 2020, when the lockdown was imposed, is difficult to reconcile with the output gap model. GDP contracted 24% in the first quarter of FY 2021, and with a reconciliation of the GDP contraction with the flaring up of inflation, not just inflation expectations, would require us to believe that the natural level of output fell more than actual output in this episode. That's very difficult to accept. Why would the natural rate of output decline by more than 25%? In a matter of such short time, it's for me quite difficult to reconcile that. The contemporaneous flaring up of expectation of inflation at that time, along with inflation, suggests of course that expectation may have something to do with inflation in India. Nobody can say no, but the agents may well be using some other model of inflation than the output gap model. Once again, the flaring up of the expectation of inflation after the lockdown and the period since, right up to November of 2020. So, and more importantly, the flaring up of expectations once again calls into question the assertion that the RBI can anchor inflation expectations in all circumstances. In the graph, we can see two instances when in recent years when the expectation of inflation has risen once quite sharply, which is after the lockdown. Here I seem to be accepting that the flaring up of expectations happened even before the lockdown. So there you are. Anyway, so I'm going to take a minute now to just look at my watch to just see how my time is going. So please give me a second. I've kept my phone away, and my timepiece is my phone these days. So. Okay, I'm within time. I'm just about 25 minutes into the talk, and I assure you, Charan, that I will finish on time. Because I really want to hear what you have to say about my presentation, not just listen to my voice. So I may move quite rapidly now, or in the interest of time. But what I say, I think, is quite clear and straightforward. And of course, we'll have a Q&A to clarify what may not have been so clear. Now we come to testing the output gap model. Galli and Gertler, Georgi Galli, one of the major proponents of the output gap model, Keynes and Phillips curve, etc. And his co-author Gertler claimed to provide, in a paper in 1999, claimed to provide micro foundations to the NKPC for a market of monopolistically competitive firms that set prices at a fixed markup over marginal cost. The notable features of their model are price rigidity and rational expectations. Price rigidity, not so much that the prices are fixed, but really that only some prices move at any point of time, which obviously means that there is some price rigidity in the system. All right. Each period, therefore, as you see, as I said, rather, only a random fraction theta of the firms reset their price, while 1 minus theta of the firms keep their prices unchanged. Now, the aggregate price level evolves as follows. Equation, PT is the aggregate price level, PT minus 1 is price level in the previous period. PT star is the optimal reset price, which is set by theta proportion of firms which actually change prices. 1 minus theta do not change prices. So they are stuck with the old price. So the price level is seen to evolve as it were, in this form. All variables expressed as a deviation from a zero inflation steady state. All right, so there you are. Now, Galli and Gertler, for this model, Galli and Gertler derived the equation for inflation as follows. This is almost, well, not quite. You'll see in a minute. That is rather like the Führer canonical form. We'll see that in a minute. So what Galli and Gertler derive is inflation related to real marginal cost. Once again, real marginal cost, which is marginal cost by prices. Monopolistically competitive firms, which are identical in all other ways, except the nature of their product, and of course expected inflation by t plus 1, beta and gamma constants again. Yeah, so here you are. This is the equation that they derive for inflation. And note that expectations are forward-looking here, but thus there is no intrinsic inertia to inflation. There's no past inflation does not matter for current inflation. However, in the model, however, motivated by the discovery of inertia in practice, i.e. estimates of the US economy, Galli and Gertler augment the new Keynes and Phillips curve, which is what I showed earlier, by allowing for a subset of firms to use what they call a backward-looking rule of thumb to set prices, i.e., expectations which are based on the past price level. Now, the resulting model may be specified as follows. It's the same model, by the way. Here you have it. And they now term this the new hybrid Phillips curve. Now, the point of estimating this model, which is not easy because it has real marginal cost in it, right? Real marginal cost in it. So estimating the model will require a measure of the real marginal cost, but real marginal cost is not observable, right? Well, even marginal cost is not so easily observable. The authors identified two possible routes. First, specifying that real marginal cost is directly related to the output gap xt, where x is the output gap and k is the output elasticity of real marginal cost. The relation can be rewritten as follows. Now you have the Führer-Phillips curve, except that Galli and Gertler write the output gap as XT, Führer writes it as YT. So inflation is related once again to the what's it called? The output gap and expected inflation. So it's quite a parsimonious model. In a sense, taking the latter route, i.e. the route of actually relating real marginal cost to the output gap would only postpone the difficulty, as the output gap is not observable and needs to be estimated prior to estimating the model itself. Galli and Gertler find this approach ad hoc, but estimate such a model nevertheless, presumably because it is routinely done. Ad hoc because they're just relating a real marginal cost to the output gap. That's right. Yeah, it's not what they've derived to start with, which is in terms of where inflation is in terms of the real marginal cost. And the second route to estimating, I'm sorry, I'm keeping going back, but that is to help you. Estimating their inflation model, which is this, is just to which they propose, Galli and Gertler, to assume Cobb-Douglas production technology, which yields real marginal cost as a ratio of the share of labor to the elasticity of output with respect to labor. Now the Phillips curve, New-Keynes and Phillips curve can be written very simply as the real marginal cost has been replaced by S, the share of labor in national income. Sorry, I should have made that clear. Share of labor in output, which is ST, where S is labor share in value added, which may be computed for the national income data. Note that the elasticity of output with respect to labor, which should have probably appeared here in the denominator, is ignored because it's assumed to not change. All right, for the share of labor. Now, I'll be very, very brief with the estimates, but though they're quite important. Estimates of an output gap model for India, which is what my co-author Parameshwaran and I estimate. It is these results are presented in a working paper of the Center for Development Studies, which is on the CDS website, for which I will show you the give you the URL at the end of our presentation. So in our estimation, we'll pursue both the routes. Remember, there are two routes. One relate inflation to the output gap, the others relate to inflation to the share of labor in value added. The Reserve Bank, by the way, I should have made that clear. The Reserve Bank follows the first route, relates at least in the document which recommended inflation targeting, which is the Urjit Patel Committee report of 2014. Inflation is related to the output gap, and it is explicitly stated that what can I say? This derives from the New Keynesian research program, to use their language. All right, so now we estimate the output gap model for two different sample periods, 1970 to the present and 1990 to the present. Two measures of inflation. We do that because two measures of inflation, which is the wholesale price index and the GDP deflator. Yeah, there you are, GDP deflator and CPI. Interestingly, Galli and Gertler use the GDP deflator, presumably because it all starts with a model of pricing for them. But CPI inflation is what is used by the central banks in the United States and the United Kingdom, perhaps because it is what Milton Friedman, to start with, had in mind when he, reinterpreted the Phillips curve and using data at two different frequencies, which is annual and quarterly. So we've estimated the output gap model in all of these cases. Two measures of the output gap were adopted. The first was the Hodrick-Prescott filter. I'm not going to spend time on this because all of you are probably familiar with it. We'll come back later. But as the Hodrick-Prescott filter has been subjected to criticism, the output gap was also calculated very simply as a deviation, the log of actual output from the log of its trend value when a linear trend is fitted to the series. I'll ask my co-author Parameshwaran at the end of this presentation to clarify whether we use a linear or quadratic trend But whatever it is, we use a trend which fits the data quite nicely. Or the model was estimated by OLS and GMM. As the results did not vary, we present only the results of estimated quarterly model CPI inflation using GMM or the generalized method of moments estimate, IV, instrumental variables estimate. So here you are, the output gap model, CPI inflation, quarterly data right up to there are 84 observations right up to 2020. And I go straight to the output gap, nothing else. The output gap is not statistically significant. Neither is a more general term, which is the deviation of output from trend, statistically significant. In fact, quite often it turns up with a negative coefficient. It's interesting enough, we estimated this under the assumption of rational expectations. We use the actual price inflation rate PT plus 1, pi t plus 1, and have used instrumental variables, which is one way of handling the endogeneity due to rational expectations. So here you are. This is the first thing we want to point out to you. We were unable to find the output gap statistically significant in any of the 6 versions of the output gap model. When versions is not correct, it's for different sample periods, different measures of inflation, and for different frequencies. Just looking at my time, please excuse me. All right, so I need to finish very, very quickly. So here is also now we also use it with in some ways Gallian-Gertler's preferred variable, not the output gap, which they consider ad hoc, but a proxy for a real marginal cost, which is the labor share, as marginal cost of firms. And here you are, the labor, whether you use OLS or GMM, the labor share is not statistically significant in the inflation equation, and if I might say so, ours is one of the few estimates of the New Keynes and Phillips curve, labor share in term instead of marginal cost as the relevant right-hand side variable. I just want to say expected inflation is significant, but I just want to say it is not clear what the significance of an expected inflation term is when the output gap is not statistically significant. So expectation of inflation being significant does not necessarily mean that the New Keynes and Phillips curve is the right descriptor of the data on inflation for India. I'm sorry, I'm going to just zip through now. Our finding the lack of the validity of the output gap model when confronted with the Indian data is in line with the findings of other researchers. See Paul in 2009, Hatekar, Sharma, Kulkarni in 2011. Now, we also want to say, before it may be assumed that this finding reflects some developing economic pathology, it may be noted that Rudd and Whelan failed to find the output gap model validated for US data. It's a paper published in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. But we want to say that the output gap model has been validated for India using core inflation as a measure. 2 comments are in order here. India's inflation, central bank targets headline inflation, so it's headline inflation that needs to be addressed, and not core inflation. Secondly, we find econometrically something which I hinted at the very beginning, that core inflation is affected by find that it does not follow an autonomous process. More to the point, it is unlikely that inflation can be controlled without stabilizing food price inflation. Does the finding that the output gap model is without statistical validity when confronted with the Indian data leave us without a model of inflation for India? That is certainly not true. I absolutely don't have time to present the most important part of our paper, where we present an alternative model. But this is the shape of the model, where inflation related to the relative price of agriculture, wage level, and industrial costs, if you wish, wages and prices, all in relation to the lagged price level, PT minus 1. We have no time to show you to discuss the results, except that the relative price of agriculture is statistically significant. it shows the price of oil, unsurprisingly, right? So we'll just move. I just want to say the expansive part is model is extraordinarily high for the model. It changes 0.616. Yeah, GMM it's a little lower. Now I have no time to do this. Yeah, I just want to say that the output gap model that inflation underpins inflation targeting is not validated for India does not mean that we cannot explain low inflation after 2016. We actually explained it quite nicely by the structuralist model. So forecasts in the structuralist model also predict a decline in inflation from, no, I would say also, sorry, predict an inflation decline from Q1 of 2016-17. Here you are, so the decline in inflation since 2016 can be explained without reference to the anchoring of inflation expectations by the Reserve Bank of India. Interestingly enough, it can be explained. Here you are, declining relative price of food. Yeah, so yeah, I have 5 slides, Sharon, if I might just say, show them. On the presumed benefits of inflation targeting, I just look at 4 variables. I just want to show that if you estimate breakpoints, a small point about yeah, the rate of growth declines. Inflation targeting seems not to have helped that at all. It hasn't turned around. Here you are. This is for the Modi period. Here you have from 2016. Interesting enough, the rate of growth begins to taper down. That's clearly, of course, due to demonetization. Every reason to believe that is due to demonetization. It's certainly not due to inflation targeting, but inflation targeting hasn't helped after this one-shot policy intervention in the form of what's it called? Demonetization. But much, much more important, private investment, in particular corporate investment, despite having a government which is generally seen as being business friendly, has not been able to help with corporate private investment. I'm sorry, I must stop with 18-19 because the last year for which this breakup is available in the official data, as far as I know, corporate investment has declined since inflation, 16-17. So one of the prime consequences of inflation, of controlling inflation, sorry, is considered to be for private investment. Stanley Fischer, that doesn't seem to have happened in India. Now, could IT have been harmful? There is a tremendous rise in the real repo rate from 2013, and it's remained elevated for the next 7 years. That may have been harmful. Now, how is low inflation helped with exports? It's often argued that stable inflation helps. It certainly hasn't helped very much. By and large, apart from one terrific year, to 18-19, exports have generally been lower than they have been in the 4 years before inflation targeting. And I just wanted to show you this has happened despite this is GDP growth, right? The fixed line, despite GDP growth having been quite steady in this. The blue line, that pale blue line is GDP growth. GDP growth has not fluctuated very much till before the pandemic, but Indian exports seem to have fallen. The real interest rates in India have been much higher than Asia. Yeah, and almost finally, NPAs, though NPAs begin to gently rise from about 10, 11 again, yeah, more like from 12. They do rise quite sharply after 2016. This rise may, of course, be attributed entirely to the reclassification, but after that, it cannot be. High interest rates may have had a role. NPAs began to rise, the high interest rate regime from 2013, 14. So I just want to finish with that. This is a quotation from Stiglitz's CBB placement lecture at the Reserve Bank of India in 2013. Central banks, including the Reserve Bank of India, should broaden their objectives beyond inflation. They need to focus on employment growth and financial employment growth and financial stability. Not the ambition of these two. It doesn't mean that inflation, control of inflation is irrelevant, and monetary policies need to be coordinated with fiscal policy. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry, I may have may have overshot very, very briefly. I won't look at my last slide. I won't even discuss my conclusion because these are just some of the references we have. All right. Thank you very much. How do I stop sharing? I stopped sharing. Give me a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just start with a few observations before I open the floor for questions. Of course, we are looking at the chat. I think both Dr. Charan Singh and I will look at the chat part if you want to put in your questions. So a couple of points. First, in the kind of when you gave the broad picture, and then towards the end, you also talked about the policy and the inflation and growth, the kind of linkages. I would just like to point out that in case you're formally writing a paper, we have a paper called J-Curve of Institutional Reform in your paper. You might refer to an E-Foundation paper. Dr. Charan Singh will send it to you, a copy, where we actually look at we look at both the MPC and other institutional reforms in an integrated way and look through all the data on various aspects and come to certain conclusions, which at least as a reference could go into your paper. Because it says something about that.
I'll be interested in seeing that.
Yeah. So and the thing there's that actually, anyway, let me leave it at that because we are running out of time for questions. Second point on, I just want to highlight some of the things that I came across. One, of course, your point is worth thinking about, that really expectations have not really been anchored, which was a point you made somewhere in the middle of your presentation. I found that interesting, which requires a little bit more thinking.
Dr. Virmani, it is anchored, anchored at a much higher level than the upper band. That's the point.
Yeah. I mean, you can respond later. Let me just give out the points.
I'm so sorry.
We are running out of time, so I'm just going to make some observations, and you can clarify or whatever. But I found that an interesting point. I'm just highlighting it.
Thank you.
So the third thing which I would kind of, and this is more of a caution, that really the pandemic was both a supply and a demand shock. And again, we have a paper on this again at EGROW, which Sharan, perhaps you can send that paper also. The first one, we had a whole series, but it's very important to be a little careful. Pandemic was very unusual. You took note of some things related to inflation, but there were many other aspects which really confound the whole thing. So one has to be a little careful there. And the fourth point, the formal model we estimate, of course, is a formal paper. I think at least I need to reflect a little more on it. But here you may just clarify if I'm not. If I got this point correct, I think you said that the output gap is not influential if we use CPI inflation general, but maybe having some effect if we use only the core. That part, there's a lot of debate and discussion. If you have more on it later. The issue is that earlier research seemed to suggest that in India at least, and actually in many developing countries, the total inflation actually does feed into the core. But we heard a previous speaker, I think the previous speaker, tell us that the research which he has done suggests that it has gone back to what we conventionally think of, that it does not affect. The core is what focus on. So this whole issue of core versus this, if you have any observations generally, would may be useful. And finally, I wasn't very sure where you get the two issues where I wasn't really sure, which would help me in understanding. One is the labor share. Where do you get an annual labor share? I don't know where I would get that if I wanted to work on that. And second, what structural model were you talking about when you gave some structural model results? So maybe these two are specific questions. If you can just explain, and then we'll open it up, to questions, and you can comment on the others whenever you feel like it.
Dr. Virmani, thank you very much. You seem to have listened to my talk very carefully. I appreciate that, and all the observations that you made. I don't remember the order of the last two questions, but let me answer the one that I remember first. The labor share is taken from the national account statistics. So it's easy. National account statistics. You have wages and total national income. So it's for the macro economy, wages to GDP is your labor share. And in fact, you said, where do you get it for the annual? You have it only for the annual. You don't have it for the quarterly. So I should have made that clear. For the annual, it's easy. You have annual wage data, wages and salaries to be precise. And you have annual. So this is not from firm level data. This is macroeconomic, which anyways, inflation is a macroeconomic phenomenon. And Galli and Gertler are also explaining that at a macro level, which is how you should explain it in any case.
Okay, I'll maybe get the precise reference from you later for my own personal.
Yeah, sure. Okay. But Dr. Virmani, for you, it should be easy as a former chief economic advisor. This is nothing more than the NAS, the National Account Statistics, your wages and salaries, and your GDP. The wage share is wages and salaries.
I don't know where that is. I have looked for this in recent times.
Really?
You did a major study.
Okay.
Stop giving it. I don't know where it is.
Okay. No. Anyway. We will get back to you. And since this is such an important question, give me a minute. Let me just ask my.
Later.
Do it later. All right.
No, we'll do that later, separately.
Fine, we'll do that separately. But the other question, in a sentence, the result that I referred to, that core is affected by agricultural prices, is our own regressions. Our own tests show that core is influenced by agricultural prices. This is for the most recent data, so it's unambiguously the case. But Dr. Virmani, much more interestingly, if you just eyeball the RBI data, which are presented in my second slide or something, my first data slide, you see core also declining as general and food prices decline. That, of course, cannot clinch it, but I'm just trying to say our econometric results are perfectly plausible because that is what you find even if you just eyeball the data. So that's all I want to say now. I suppose there are Q&As and I want to answer that. But thank you again for the questions and following my talks.
Thank you. Okay, Charan, do you see any questions? Forgot, I was listening to him, so I didn't catch the audience questions.
There's a question coming from Krishnanan Tripathi. He's typing in, and we welcome questions from the audience. But I had one very basic question, Professor. You were mentioning about, can I call it the inflation moderation, something which Lawrence Ball and Sheridan speak about in their paper in 2012, I think. So where they show that inflation targeting or no inflation targeting, there was inflation moderation across the planet, and they take number of countries, and then they show inflation trend has been the same, downwards. Now, when you were mentioning about the inflation trend 2016 onwards, were you also having the same thing in mind?
No, Charan, not at all. Did you say 2016 or 2010 onwards? I emphasize both. But 2016, no. As far as we are concerned, of course, it is possible that globally it's also declining, but I didn't have time to actually show the statistics. But the structuralist model, I'm so sorry, I have no time to discuss it, but it is in the working paper that I referred to, and it's also in my book, Pricing and Inflation in India. The structuralist model forecasts the decline in inflation in India from 2016. That's what I want to say. And the correlation between actual and forecast is quite high. It's 0.79. It's 0.79, the correlation coefficient. So, which is extremely high, actually. So I'm just trying to say the fact that the output gap model doesn't look so good doesn't mean we don't have an explanation of inflation in India. We have a perfectly consistent explanation of inflation.
Another related question.
So Charan, I don't really have a view because we haven't looked at it, what's happening in the rest of the world. I can't answer that. That may be happening, but we can explain it in terms of our model. That's all I wish to say.
Sure. Now, Professor, again, putting on the economist hat, you know, many people in the country have said IT that we adopted about 5 years ago. Of course, we adopted it formally from January 14, but it got the legal thing from October 2016.
Correct, you're absolutely right.
So many people say that inflation targeting has anchored inflation expectations. And you in your equations also use inflation expectations.
Correct.
Many a times, I wonder, in a country like India, where we are still prone to monsoons, do we really think, or can we really think that inflation expectations can be anchored to be successful? And then you see that correlation happening between the actual inflation and the expected inflation. Means, what would be your view on expected inflation and anchoring of expected inflation in a country like India?
Right. I just wish to say, with the output gap model not being statistically significant, if I were to take my own results seriously, then any change in expectations cannot be explained in terms of the Reserve Bank's actions or the central bank's actions, because the central bank is supposedly targeting expectations or anchoring expectations by signaling what is the level of the output gap it will tolerate in the next period, or it will deliver, which is a better word, via its interest rate policies. Now, if the output gap is not statistically significant, I'm sorry to say, I cannot take the logic of a central bank, whichever it is, whether it is RBI or any other central bank, anchoring in expectations. So that's the first thing I want to say. But this does not necessarily mean for a minute expectations are irrelevant to inflation. Maybe the agents are holding the structuralist model in their minds, which seems to make a lot of sense. Maybe they are attending the EGROW seminar right now, Charan, and looking at these regression results, which show the structuralist model, which is based on the relative price of agriculture, which is probably roughly what you hinted at when you talked about monsoon. Maybe they have their model, and when they find that they believe that the harvest is going to be bad or there are going to be shortages, expectations rise and inflation rises. Of course, you should have a very good story of why expectations matter, and we have one in our structuralist model, which of course I didn't have time, unfortunately, to exposit at all. So that is my answer to you. I am very skeptical. Well, interesting, I am very skeptical. Our model suggests that the central bank in India cannot anchor expectations. And that is also shown by expectations, the RBI's own household expectations survey showing household expectations, what's the right word? Stationary for almost 10 years, from 2009 to 2020. That is the RBI's own survey data. So that's my answer.
That's a very good, that's a very good point. You know, I was on the, during that informal period of inflation targeting before the MPC was set up, I was on the high level committee on monetary policy. And I repeatedly pointed out to Governor Rajan and Urjit Patel that, you know, these expectations have no relationship to anything. I mean, this is, that question was answered directly. So I think it's a very good point that you are confronting it head on and bringing it to the center of discussion. I really appreciate that. But, you know,
you're very kind, Dr. Kirpani. I'm joking. If I was a younger man, I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dare make a point like this because I probably wouldn't get tenure.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is not what I'm trying to say. This is something
You might have to leave the
was
institution.
on my mind for a decade. That I look at these expectations and they look meaningless to me. And I think the process what you're hinting is that consumer expectations are basically seem to be connected to food prices, which is the point you also kind of making directly or indirectly. Okay.
That we cannot assert, but it makes perfect sense that that would be the case.
Yeah. Okay. So I think if there's one question, there's a gentleman who's given a long private message to me. I don't know. Maybe Mr. Agarwal, are you there? You want to ask a short question? Harshit Agarwal?
Yes, good evening.
Yeah, okay, keep it short because we are running out of time. Yeah.
Yes, so my question was essentially where the paper where Gali and Gertler talk about their hybrid New Keynesian Phillips curve, and you have referred to the same approach, I'm guessing, where you're supplementing the real marginal cost component with just output gap in terms of real GDP gap, right? So now
I'm not sure what you mean. We are estimating exactly the model which Gali and Gertler estimate. Yeah. Yes. By virtue of the fact that Gali is probably the best known exponent of the NKPC.
Yes.
And the Reserve Bank claims that its model of inflation targeting is based on the NKPC. Carry on. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in case of RBI's model, which they use for forecasting core CPI, essentially, the RMC component not only accounts for GDP gap, but it also accounts for your exchange rate gap, and separately accounts for your real differences in your food prices and fuel prices quarterly. Food prices and real prices. So the inclusion of that could turn your real marginal cost component significant, and in turn your expectation significant as well. Where in that case, the model can be a good outlook for your inflation expectation of forecasting. Essentially, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Mr. Agarwal, thank you very much. And I'm also aware of some working paper from the RBI, which was featured in the Economic Times about 2 months ago. But I've always felt, that the approach that you are referring to, a hybrid is hybrid is not a term that I use particularly favorably. That is a model without any foundations. I mean, the New Keynesian Phillips curve has only real marginal cost and forward expectation, inflation expectation. Now you're throwing everything into it. That I don't feel very comfortable with. Maybe you might think of me as a professor, a bit purist, but that is, that's without foundation. That is ad hoc for me. Gali and Gertler themselves will call it ad hoc. On the other hand, the structuralist model derives an inflation equation and is estimating that. Which has no output gap in it. The output gap is a macroeconomic variable, quite rightly. But the relative price is formed by sectoral balances between the agriculture and the non-agricultural sectors. And I don't think you can combine them. That is my view. I'm aware a lot of people do this. I think it is illegitimate, let me use that word, to try and combine the output gap and relative prices. A lot of people say that the relative price shifts the inflation curve. That's geometry. That's not economic theory.
Okay, so let me ask you a final question then. I think Dr. Charan Singh also wanted similar, because we are going to have a series of talks. But if you want to say anything on, there's a review of the MPC framework underway, we understand. If you have any views, assuming that the framework will remain there, is there any incremental change or any change you would recommend? That is kind of a final question, so to say.
Thank you.
And feel free to speculate, or you don't have to be precisely academic. What is it that you feel?
No, absolutely. No. Thank you very much, Dr. Birmani, for giving me this opportunity. I would just say, I wouldn't answer your question directly, but I would say something which has a great bearing on the debate on this, which we've been reading in the media over the past 2 weeks. If you ask me, shifting around the band is meaningless. Personally, I find the output gap insignificant. and so many other people have also done it. By the way, the reference which we give to some person by the name of Paul, his article, Biru Paksha, BP Paul, and I have, if you look at the share screen, you'll see in the references. His paper is titled "The Elusive Quest for the Phillips Curve." It's difficult to find the Phillips curve as a reasonable description of inflation in India to start with, and then to spend all your time, should the band be 4% or should the band be 3%, or to me seems to be beside the point. You can really stabilize inflation in India only if you stabilize food prices. That's a difficult thing to do. And the other thing I want to say, it hasn't happened very much of late, but it's probably happened recently, partly for political reasons. The central government raises, what do you call it, procurement prices, in around 2009-10 by up to 40% and all the rest of it, the real procurement prices. And then it looks at the Reserve Bank and says, now please control inflation. This is crazy. This is just nonsense. It doesn't work. All right, so that's our segment.
Yeah, I think the message is very clear. Yeah. Okay. So, Charan, can I hand it over? Thank you, Professor. And let me hand it to Charan for his final.
Professor, there is a question from Mr. Krishnanand Tripathi, ETV Bharat. It is on your, I've sent you on your WhatsApp, but I can read it. There are reports that the government may keep the same band for the RBI, 2 to 6%. Do you agree with the band, or should we revise it or give some more flexibility to the RBI?
Charan, he's already answered it.
Charan,
he's already answered it. He's saying he doesn't really care. It's irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Dr. Virbani. You are read my mind perfectly.
I gave that question only. Yeah. No, that was the question I asked implicitly.
Okay. But Dr. Virbani, let me say now, since we are discussing, just give me a minute. If you ask me, I would say, why have a ban? Why not zero? I'm not being funny. Just not being funny. What is the
right. So, okay, let's have a few minutes of discussion. So, basically, what you're saying is that the focus of the whole system, whether it's RBI, whatever, should be on stabilizing food prices, and what is the best way to do that, whether it's export policy, whatever, MPC, the minimum support price, whatever, but that should be the focus.
Absolutely, for inflation controls. And I just want to conclude by I just want to conclude by saying that skepticism about inflation targeting, I've said it in a slide, does not mean that one doesn't believe that inflation control should be a legitimate objective. Inflation, and by the way, that there has been inflation control from the 1950s in India. It may not have been wildly successful, but there has been concern about inflation control in India even before inflation targeting. That's all I wish to say.
Okay, now I would like to mention that the recording for today would be available by noon tomorrow on our website, and I will share a link with Professor as well as put it on the Twitter, and I'm sure many people will benefit from the discussion we have had today. I would also like to mention tomorrow evening, 6:30 to 7:30, we have Professor Ashima Goyal from IGIDR talking to us on fine-tuning the flexible inflation targeting. And next week on Friday, that is March 26, we have Chetan Ghate speaking to us on agriculture prices and inflation targeting, something where we are concluding our discussion today. And I think he's going to spend about 40-45 minutes on that very topic. And in this series of inflation targeting, we have Dr. Sujit Bhalla, presently ED at the IMF. He's presenting a paper on April 2 on inflation targeting with us. So with this lecture series that we have in front of us, I would invite each one of you to really come and join and take the benefit of this, bringing the best minds on policy-oriented research to our audience. I once again thank.
Charan, sorry, I just want to apologize to Dr. Rekha Jagannath. Sadly, it was too late. I had finished it before I saw your question. Sorry. Anyway, Charan, finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you very much. It was a good paper.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't take your question. I'm sorry. You can
That's okay.
always send it to me, madam. Send it to me by WhatsApp or something.
No, we'll all.
No, that's okay.
If the chairman agrees, we will all benefit from the discussion. And the Friday evening.
If you want, I had to kind of go. Why don't you continue? Yeah, if you want to continue, why don't you go ahead?
Madam, would you like to ask your question? We'll all benefit from that discussion.
No,
okay.
I agree with the Pulapre Balakrishna that inflation targeting is very useful to predict the trends, but in an inflationary country like India, we have extensively used it. But then right now we are in a transition stage where inflation is less important than recession. Then investment is worrisome. Price rise, inflation expectations would really help investment, but then the confusion is about the supply and demand factors both changing. And then, as you said, there is structural change. And during the structural change, macroeconomic factors other than price changes affect the economy, due to which inflation expectations take the backseat. We are so much worried about inflation as much as the other factors. The macroeconomic factors, like the institutional factors, the other questioner tried to raise in the discussion. Other than the institutional factors, we also have emergencies like the pandemic itself, raising socio-economic aspects like welfare itself, becoming more important than prices. Price rise is not so worrisome right now. So it's not really very useful in the present juncture, according to me. I don't know what you feel. Maybe you wanted to raise this point because you have spoken about structural change. Thank you.
Charan?
Yeah.
Charan, you're going to have to give me a minute. I just want to show a slide. It'll take me just half a minute because Dr. Jagannath has raised an important point about the times and what it means. So let me just see if I can pull up my. I've closed it. Is it?
Sure, take your time because I think we're all.
I'm very happy that you use very genuine data from RBI and then economic survey, which are all very dependable data. But still, when the factor itself goes to the background, the factor itself goes to the background.
Right. Yeah. Sorry,
inflation itself goes.
Yeah. Charan, I'm not going to show the slide because I'm afraid that I will lose all of you if I show them. So I'll just mention the statistic that I wanted. I'm quite struck by Dr. Jagannath's comment about the situation has changed now. She used the word welfare. Maybe that's not the word that I would use. But I just wanted to point out that the most recent unemployment data from the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey of the CSO, now the NSO, shows that the unemployment rate in April to June of 2020, which was the period of the pandemic, period of the lockdown, was 20%, having been 8% till then. So I'm just trying to say, I have no. So that is the increase in unemployment due to the lockdown from 8% to 20%. Are you hearing me, Dr. Rekha? Can you hear me? You can't.
I'm sure is hearing. And this is all still on record. So tomorrow
8% to 20% is inflation expectations.
No. I'm just trying to say you made an interesting point about times change.
Yes.
And now we're at a
Yes.
time when inflation may be less important. And I'm just mentioning
Yes.
the statistic that in the period April to June of 2020,
Yeah.
which was the period of the lockdown, unemployment rose from 8% to 20%. Can you hear me? You can't hear me. Yeah. That is from the PLF, as the Periodic Labor Force Survey data. So that is the kind of situation we're facing today. I'm just providing a statistic in response to what you have said. That's all. Maybe I don't want to hold up the proceedings longer. So thank you very much for your question. Thank you, Charan, for allowing me to answer it.
Thank you very much. I think we have
Thank you. Agreed with your structural model is what is
Sure.
right.
Thank you so
Absolutely right.
And let's conclude here. Tomorrow evening, 6:30, I invite all of you once again to be with us, and we'll then listen to Professor Ashima Goel from IGIDR. Thank you once again. See you all tomorrow. Bye.
Charan, if I could just make a comment to thank EGROW and you particularly for this invitation. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, if academics could conduct their seminars with such courtesy,
Thank you.
I would be a happier man. But thank you very much indeed.
Policy-oriented research, and we're all working on that in our minds, that this is the month for review of inflation target.
Right.
So let's provide the best inputs to the policymakers.
Thank you very much.
The inputs are very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.